this morning to look at the $180 billion anti-missile defense program that's being set up, that is in place for preventing North Korea launches or defending against North Korean launches. And our guest is Jamie McIntyre, longtime Washington defense and national security reporter and senior writer now with the Washington Examiner. Jamie McIntyre, if Pyongyang this morning were to launch a missile, a test missile or otherwise, what is the first step in U.S. defense?
Well, the first thing that the U.S. Strategic Command would have to determine, along with the Pacific Command, is does the missile actually pose a threat, either to the United States or its allies, Japan, South Korea? And they do that by tracking the trajectory and the speed of the missile. So we just saw North Korea launch a couple of medium-range missiles into the Sea of Japan. There was no attempt to shoot those down because it was determined they were going to fall harmlessly into the sea, even though they were heading toward the northern coast of Japan. So the first thing would be to determine if it was a threat. If they were going to try and shoot down a North Korean missile, there's a number of systems that would be employed. The U.S. has a ballistic missile defense system that's based on multiple layers and redundancy. You don't want to just have one shot at a missile. So one of the most effective defenses they have is what's called the Aegis system. It's on U.S. And Japanese ships in the Pacific, and it's able to track a missile and shoot it down in its trajectory using what's called a standard missile. But there's interconnected systems. We have the THAAD system. That's a ground-based system that has very powerful radars. They would communicate with the ships. And then we have land-based interceptors based in Alaska and California, that if the missile were to be very high into space and heading for the U.S. mainland, those ground-based interceptors would attempt to shoot it down.
How quickly can we notice a missile being launched?
Oh, almost, we have satellite surveillance. We can tell almost immediately. And we watch the North Koreans very closely, so we have a pretty good idea when they're about to do something. Although one of the things about one of the latest missile tests they had was that was a little bit worrisome is not so much the missile itself, which was not necessarily new technology, but they're developing better mobile launchers. This way they can have the missile on a launcher, it can be hidden somewhere, it can drive out to a location, set up, and shoot very quickly, and that doesn't give the United States the same amount of warning. So when you talk about missile defenses, there's three places where you can shoot down a missile. In the boost stage, when it's on its way up, in the mid-course, when it's sort of in space, or the terminal phase when it's on its way down. And right now, we don't have good technology to shoot down a missile in the boost phase, and that's where a lot of the research is going on now.
And you're joining us this morning to talk about, in particular, the North Korean missile anti-defense program. We do this as the United States is unrolling or unveiling this new terminal high-altitude defense, this THAAD or THAAD system.
Yeah, it's pronounced THAAD. It used to be called Theater High Altitude, and then they changed it to Terminal because it's kind of in the terminal phase. And so the United States has had this system for a while. They've tested it. It's actually, in tests, turned out to be quite effective. You may recall over the years, as the United States has spent billions of dollars on missile defense, hearing about failed tests, from time to time.
Yeah.
Because this is, I was starting to say it's not rocket science, but obviously it is rocket science. But it's not technology that's beyond our capability. But it's difficult, and it takes a lot of coordinating of sensors and radars to do. But over time, these have gotten more successful, and this THAAD system is quite effective. It's one of the reasons that China is so worried about it. So the United States and South Korea decided a year ago that they should deploy this missile system to the south to protect against the threat from North Korean missiles. It's a system that can be deployed and set up very quickly, but it hasn't deployed very quickly, and that's because of political reasons, not technical reasons. South Korea is under a lot of pressure from China not to accept this system, and because China sees it as something, well, first of all, it has very powerful radars. It can see into China. It also is something that, although it's aimed at defending against North Korea, could possibly neutralize some of the Chinese missiles. So they're not happy about it, and they've been putting a lot of pressure on South Korea not to accept the deployment.
Jamie McIntyre is our guest here to talk about the anti-missile defense system, North Korean missile launches. We welcome your calls in the conversation. 202-748-8000 for Democrats, 202-748-8001. Republicans, Independents, and all others, 202-748-8002. We do this with the rollout last week of that THAAD system, the delivery to South Korea, the missile shield parts arriving in South Korea. But there's also a trip this week by the Secretary of State, and the Wall Street Journal writes about that. Secretary of State Tillerson will travel to the region this week on a trip that will include stops in Japan, South Korea, and China. State Department officials said the threat posed by North Korea will be high on Mr. Tillerson's agenda. What message will he be bringing?
Well, I'd be surprised if it's not the only thing on his agenda, because that's really the issue that's preeminent in that area. So, of course, he'll be talking to South Korea about continuing with the THAAD deployment, despite the pressure from China. China's been putting economic pressure on the South not to accept it. And, you know, we just had an impeachment of the South Korean president, and they're going to have elections in about 60 days to select a new president. One of the front runners in that election process is opposed to the THAAD deployment. So the United States is going to want to get some reassurances from South Korea that they're going to continue with that. And, you know, a lot of people may not realize that the United States is committed by treaty to defend South Korea from any invasion from the north. You know, the Korean War didn't end with a peace agreement. It just ended with an armistice, a cessation of hostilities. There's never been a peace agreement. And the U.S. and South Korea are linked. So unlike some places where if there was a rising tension, you know, there might be a debate in Congress, should we go to war, should we do something? In South Korea, we're obligated by treaty to work with the Republic of Korea forces in defending the southern Korean peninsula. So the United States sees it as vitally important as part of that military commitment that this missile system be deployed there.
And that $180 billion we're talking about, is that strictly for our North Korean efforts or anti-missile efforts there?
Well, I got to tell you that. So I put that number in one of my stories because I'm trying to figure out what we spent on missile defenses from the time we really got serious about it. And if you go back all the way to the beginning of when President Reagan was talking about Star Wars, you know, the Strategic Defense Initiative, you could figure we've spent maybe as much as $300 billion trying to develop ways to shoot down a missile with a missile over the years. But sort of looking back at the point when we started developing the current system, the multi-layered system, you know, that's a good estimate of what we spent over the last 20 years on everything. So that's the ground-based system, the ship-based system, the THAAD system, the Patriot system, which we may remember from the 1990s.
Including some of the land-based systems here in the United States in places like Hawaii?
That's what the whole thing costs. And of course, the knock against missile defenses is that, you know, people have said, well, they can't really work. They can only, if they do work, they only be able to shoot down a limited number of missiles. They won't be able to handle decoys in space. But these are all technological problems that the United States has been working on. And one of the things that you can look at is how do the adversaries of the United States view these missile defense systems? And whether it's Iran or Russia or China, they all think they work. They're convinced that these are effective systems and that could neutralize their threat. So I think that's an indication right there.
We have calls waiting. We go to Richard first in Malden, Massachusetts, Independent Line.
Good morning.
Good morning.
My personal point of view is this is a big scare tactic, you know, to get the American people behind this big budget that we're going to have for defense, for the military and the build-up of our military. North Korea has no intentions of bombing us or bombing North Korea. I mean, Japan and China. This is a big, you know, every time the budget comes up and more money comes up, they start flying. Oh yeah, now they're shooting missiles, and before there was sunk a, you know, a South Korean ship, and North Korea did it, and all this stuff. So it's a big scare tactic, and just to get us behind them for the budget. And thank you very much for listening to me.
Well, I would just say that, you know, if you believe that this is all bluster from the North Koreans, you have to say that you don't take North Korean leader Kim Jong-un at his word, because he said specifically that his goal is to develop a missile that can reach the United States and top it with a nuclear warhead so that he can threaten the United States with a nuclear attack. That's his stated goal. And why does he want to do that? Because he wants to have an ironclad guarantee that his regime will be able to hold on to power. And he sees nuclear weapons as the way to guarantee that, because North Korea is constantly paranoid that there's going to be some invasion from the south. You know, the U.S. is involved right now in massive military exercises with the South Koreans. It's called Foal Eagle. They do it every year. About 300,000 forces from the Republic of Korea and a much smaller number of U.S. forces take part in this annual exercise. And every year North Korea says that they believe this is a rehearsal for an invasion of the North, and they issue bellicose rhetoric. But, you know, there was a time, I think you could, maybe 5-10 years ago, where you could sort of dismiss the North Korean threat, saying, well, they don't really have the ability to do this, and it would be suicide, they would never do this. But when you see what they've done over the past 10 years, working methodically toward getting this capability, I think it would be foolish not to take that somewhat seriously. And the key about missile defenses is now, you know, that's your last resort. I mean, you want to pressure the North Korean regime with sanctions and international pressure, but at the same time, if the security of the United States is at stake, say the fate of a city on the West Coast that could be hit with a nuclear weapon, I think you'd want to have some sort of defense that you'd be able to employ in that sort of worst-case scenario.
Here's Keyport, New Jersey. We welcome Pat on our Republican line.
Hi, I have two quick questions for you. The first one is, how valid is THAAD for South Korea? Is there enough time to respond to any kind of attack? Because the missile wouldn't have to travel that far to do damage to Seoul. And number two, you said they had been developing better mobile launchers. Does that mean that, doesn't that limit the range of the range of the missile if it's not in a fixed silo? Doesn't that limit the size of the missile and how far it can go? And how effective would it be? And how do we defend against it?
Well, it's difficult to defend against. So taking the second part of the question first, these missile launchers, which, by the way, in military parlance are called a TEL, for a teleporter. But, you know, in order for those kinds of missiles to be effective, they need to have solid fuel. Because, so a missile that you put on a launch pad and you fill up with liquid fuel, you can see that, you can see the fueling process, you could take that out on the launch pad pretty easily. But if you're able to use solid fuel in your missile, then you can have these missiles that are on launchers. And yes, they could have an extended range. And as for the question about how effective THAAD would be for South Korea, it would be effective against short and medium, intermediate range missiles that go, you know, up in at a very high trajectory, you know. But the caller has a point, because Seoul, which is, you know, only 20 miles from the DMZ, is very vulnerable to attack from the north, not even from missiles, but just from artillery. The North Koreans have thousands of pieces of artillery. They could rain artillery shells down on Seoul. That's always been the threat. If there was an all-out war on the Korean Peninsula. But if there was a single missile that was fired and it looked like it might hit South Korea, the THAAD missile system would have a pretty good chance of shooting it down. Is it perfect? No system is perfect. But it would be, in tests, in the last tests of THAAD, 13 attempts where they test as shooting down a missile. It's been successful 13 times.
And again,
that's a pretty good record.
THAAD is Terminal High Altitude Area Defense, and the process here from Lockheed Martin on their site looks like this. A radar detects an incoming threat. The target is identified and engaged. Interceptor is fired from a truck-mounted launcher. The interceptor uses kinetic energy to destroy the incoming missile. That's from Lockheed Martin. Let's hear from David in Colorado Springs on our Democrats line. Good morning.
Yeah, as far as South Korea and the ballistic missiles coming from North Korea, I think they've got that covered as long as they have a good radar screen. The thing that I was thinking about was a long time ago during the Bush administration, they ran a test from California to Kwajalein and from Kwajalein to California. The test going out for incoming missiles failed. For the test coming in from Kwajalein, those succeeded. Have they managed to reverse that process, or are we still shaking our heads trying to figure out when this stuff is going to hit the West Coast, which I seriously doubt is going to happen?
Well, you're talking about the tests that have taken part in trying to develop the so-called ground-based missile defense system, the interceptor missiles that would be fired from the continental United States. And they have tested those with missiles. And if you think back into the 90s when a lot of these tests were going on and there were a lot of failures, many of the failures had to do with the fact that the target missiles they were using didn't fire properly. So it wasn't really a true test of the ability of a missile to intercept it. And there were some misses as well. But the technology continues to get better. The most recent test of the ground-based system, which was in 2014, was a success. It was a hit. And this is hit-to-kill technology. It's not explosive. It is, as you said, kinetic energy, where they just actually hit the incoming warhead. You know, it's never been used in combat. It's never been used in a hostile situation. So we don't know absolutely for sure, you know, what would happen. But we keep testing it and we keep building it. And the Trump administration is going to continue to put billions of dollars into the system.
On the line next is Maurice in East Dublin, Georgia, Democrats line. Go ahead.
Good morning. How are you?
Fine, thanks.
Well, first and foremost, all of this, if you talk about distractions, this is a major distraction from my estimation, because for all of the talk about the THAAD system going into South Korea, why has it not been employed in Western Europe? Hasn't there been an objection by Russia over the course of many years to this and various systems like this being employed in Germany and Poland and countries of that sort? And also, to talk about the amount of money that has gone into research and development, go back 30-some-odd years when Reagan's actually started this program. So there's probably been at least $1 trillion that have been invested in this particular program or programs such as this over the course of time. So just keep those things in mind as you're having this discussion.
Well, as I said, if you actually go back to the beginning of missile defense, you know, again, the dream of a space-based strategic defense initiative, I think a good estimate that critics of missile defense would agree on is about $300 billion. So not $1 trillion, but a lot of money. And as for deploying missile defenses in Europe, the caller has a point. The U.S. does believe that there's a need for missile defenses in Europe. Not so much this THAAD system, but there's two things they're using, and one is the Aegis system that I mentioned on U.S. ships can be deployed in the Mediterranean to counter the missile threat from Iran. And there's also something called Aegis Ashore. It's essentially the ship-based system using the same standard missile, but in a configuration that can be deployed on land. In addition, the United States wants to put powerful radars in countries like Poland to augment a national defense system, a more robust system. And it's true, Russia is very upset about that. And again, I think that's an indication about the Russians believe this is an effective system, even as critics here still question whether it's all that effective. And there's also talk of building, putting land-based interceptors on the east coast of the United States to defend from the threat in that direction, even though the biggest threat is seen from North Korea.
Well, like our caller, you write in your Washington Examiner piece, there are still skeptics who think shooting down long-range missiles in space remains a pipe dream left over from former President Ronald Reagan's original Star Wars strategic design. Quote, "We are no closer to an effective weapon that can reliably shoot down a long-range missile than we were when Reagan announced his dream." That's Joseph Cirincione, the president of the arms control group, the Plowshares Fund.
Right. So Joe Cirincione is one of the critics who doesn't believe the technology is actually going to work, is going to be worth the investment, and believes that the solution is more on the side of arms control, nuclear denuclearization, more countries getting rid of nuclear weapons, the United States reducing its nuclear stockpile. The argument there is, you know, how many nuclear weapons do you need to actually deter someone? And don't forget, the best use of nuclear weapons is obviously not to actually employ them, but to serve as a deterrent to prevent anybody from attacking you, essentially from preventing war. Well, how many do you need to do that? Well, we can see North Korea is able to deter any attempt at invading the North, but just a handful of nuclear weapons. China has maybe 200 nuclear weapons. Nobody would contemplate attacking China. You know, Great Britain, same thing, small number of nuclear weapons. So that's part of the debate about, as we talk about the bigger program, to upgrade all three legs of the nuclear triad. Those are land-based, submarine-based, and bombers that have nuclear weapons. How much of the triad really needs to be upgraded? What should we be buying in terms of how many nuclear weapons? Remembering all along that the goal is deterrence, not actually fighting a nuclear war.
We hear from Kansas City next. We go to Maurice, Independent Line.
Yeah, how you doing there? Good show. I'm a Vietnam veteran and a 32-year Cold War veteran working in the nuclear weapons industry. I would think that everyone should have the right to protect themselves. I don't know. It seems to me, is there anything, the question to me, is there anything that we're doing to provoke these other countries to want nuclear weapons? And like you say, everyone has the right to deter and protect themselves. I don't know. It's confusing to me. Like I said, I'm a 32-year Cold War veteran. I've made many nuclear weapons parts, and I hope you understand what I'm saying.
No, I think I do. And as I mentioned earlier, the prime motivation that Kim Jong-un seems to have for having this absolute goal of getting nuclear weapons is the preservation of his regime. Without that, he sees the North as being vulnerable to being overthrown or some sort of attack. And if you go and look at Iran, it's very much the same situation. So Iran looked at what happened in the Persian Gulf War and in the invasion in 2003, and they said to themselves, you know, this wouldn't have happened to Saddam Hussein and Iraq if he had nuclear weapons. The United States would have never gone in there and toppled the regime. And so they also see the idea of having nuclear weapons as something that guarantees against a U.S. invasion. Now, Iran's a much bigger country than Iraq. Its military is more formidable, and of course, you know, at the moment there's no plans to go into Iran, but that's one of the things that drives them, this idea of security. So, in order to dissuade countries from acquiring nuclear weapons, they need to feel assured that their security is assured in other ways, and that's what the sort of global effort to hold down the spread of nuclear technology is all about. Is finding ways to reassure countries so they don't feel that they have to acquire a nuclear arsenal for their own security.
The New York Times reporting on some of the reaction, Chinese reaction to the arrival of the anti-missile defense system in South Korea last week. The headline in their piece last week saying China warns of arms race after U.S. deploys missile defense in South Korea. Here's Stephen in Lockport, New York, Independent Line. Stephen, you're on the air. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering what good is a missile defense shield when, recently we've seen reports where they're dropping these mole nukes off of our coast to cause tsunamis.
I have to say I'm not familiar with that report. And I haven't seen any tsunamis either. So.
All right, we'll go to Wynwood, Pennsylvania, Republican line. Jim, hello there.
Good morning, C-SPAN.
Good morning.
Hey, first of all, I think we're really naive if we believe that these people would never try to attack us with nuclear weapons, particularly the nutcase in North Korea. And I don't think the treaty we have, so-called treaty we have with Iran, will work in the long run. However, I really called about, there's a great article in the Wall Street Journal. The editorial page today, it says, there's a way to stop North Korean missile attacks. And it talks about a system that we partially developed, we have, that stops this in the booster process, which of course is ideal before the thing goes off the ground and before it can be blown up over North Korea's territory or China's territory or Russia's territory if we have that capability. According to the article, it's fairly easily done.
Do you know what he's talking about?
I'm not sure which system they're referring to. The United States has done a lot of research on boost phase. One of the things that sounded really promising was something called the airborne laser. That was a laser mounted on a 747 that could fly over the area and direct the laser at the missile in either before it was launched or in the boost phase. And when the missile's in the boost phase, when it's full of fuel, the slightest little thing can make it blow up. So it's very vulnerable in that phase. The airborne laser was ditched. It just, after lots of research, it just didn't work. It would require flying around the target area continuously. And now we're looking at technologies that would involve drones that would attack missiles in the boost phase. It's easy to hit a missile in the boost phase if you know where it is. It's not so easy if, as I said, if a missile launcher pulls out of a cave and fire something immediately. It might take you a little more time. But ideally, you want to have systems that work in all three of those phases, on the way up, mid-course, and on the way down, so that you don't have just one chance of shooting the missile down. And if, for instance, a long-range intercontinental ballistic missile was fired from North Korea and heading toward the United States, and we didn't know whether it was armed or not, the United States wouldn't just fire one of its interceptors to try to shoot it down. They'd probably fire 2 or 3 or 6 to maximize the ability, which is one of the reasons, by the way, why this system is really not a threat to Russia or China or somebody who has a large arsenal of missiles. Our current system could not handle a large number of incoming missiles, but it could handle a missile or two that are fired from a rogue nation such as North Korea.
Hi, our guest is Jamie McIntyre, who is a national security defense reporter with the Washington Examiner. Just over 10 minutes, 202-748-8000 for Democrats, 202-748-8001 for Republicans, and Independents, 202-748-8002. Anthony's in Greenwood, Colorado, on our independent line.
Thank you very much. Mr. McIntyre, we went through the whole Cold War, and we never launched because both sides, there was no uncertainty. It was mutual assured destruction. And so it's when there's unpredictability is when the risk is really high. So my question to you is, why have we even pursued the channel? Maybe it exists. If we were to agree that if we attack North Korea, and if that's what Kim Jong-un is really afraid of, that we're going to attack him, that China is in agreement, in certainty, says we will defend North Korea against an attack by the United States or South Korea. Wouldn't that then give them reason to disarm, and then we could pull back THAAD, and China wouldn't have the threat of us having THAAD over there? That seems kind of the solution to me. Maybe you could elaborate on that for me. Thank you.
Well, the idea that you could get to some sort of negotiated settlement, some sort of negotiated agreement in which China would play a major part is kind of the ideal scenario, what we're hoping for. The problem, of course, in dealing with North Korea is we're not dealing entirely with a rational regime. This is a regime that doesn't care much about the fate of its people. It doesn't care that that there's people are poor and that they don't have enough food. So if it was a regime that cared about those things, you could use all kinds of economic incentives to get North Korea to at least suspend its nuclear program. You could provide food aid and oil and alternate energy, and you could open markets and give development if they were concerned about that. But this seems to be a regime, the Kim regime, which is solely focused on maintaining power for a small number of individuals. It's really a brutal, ruthless regime, and it makes it very hard to negotiate. The Trump administration is hoping that China will play a part, because China seems to be the only country that has any real influence over North Korea. But even China's influence is limited. So that's one of the things we started to talk about Secretary Tillerson's trip. So that's one of the things he'll be talking about when he meets with Japan, South Korea, and he's also going to China. And then we just learned today, I believe, that the Chinese president will also be visiting the United States and visiting President Trump at his Mar-a-Lago estate.
And just to be clear, the delivery of the THAAD system, this was something that was initiated under the Obama administration. It's now being fulfilled under the Trump administration.
Well, so when they identified the need, it was last July, but then the hang-up was getting South Korea to give the final approval for it to come. The United States has been wanting to send it there, and finally, I think with these last couple of missile tests, it sort of pushed the South Korean government to say, well, despite China's objections and despite China's threats to retaliate against us economically, we're going to go ahead and take it because we need this. Now, it's thrown into a little bit of turmoil because, as I said, there's a political crisis in South Korea. They're going to have new elections. There'll be a new president. And we don't know if the new president in South Korea will be as committed to keeping THAAD there as the current regime.
Let's hear from Kim in Jacksonville, Florida. Go ahead. Democrats line.
Hi, thanks. Two things. Does China and Russia really have any leverage to stop these THAAD installations? And secondly, we all know that North Korea is belligerent, and probably the only reason they would attack anybody is if Kim Jong-il just gets mad one day and pushes the button. Is there no consensus that would say that if North Korea does anything, launches anything, that they would be wiped out and it would be the end of the Kim Il-sung administration?
Well,
Thanks.
when Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis, one of his first trips when he took over was to go to Korea and Japan to reassure U.S. allies that the U.S. remained steadfast. And he's issued a number of statements that had basically said if North Korea were to employ nuclear weapons, that the response from the United States would be immediate and devastating. And, they didn't specify that the U.S. would have a nuclear response, but essentially that it would be the end of the North Korean regime. The U.S., by the way, has practiced for and rehearsed for war on the Korean Peninsula for years. They have all kinds of plans if the North Koreans were ever to start a war, how to finish it, and you can imagine all the war games that the United States does. And part of that is this big exercise that goes on for 2 months where they rehearse that. So if North Korea ever does either come invade the South or attack an ally with a nuclear weapon, it would result in all-out war in the Korean Peninsula, and the U.S. military is confident that it would prevail.
Has their technology gotten better over recent years?
The North Koreans?
Yes.
Yes, it has. And they use a lot of designs that were based on Russian missile designs. Very interesting article, by the way, in the New York Times about a week or so ago by David Sanger and William Broad, the reporters who wrote about the U.S. effort to undermine the Iranian program using a computer virus, suggesting that the U.S. during the Obama administration has done the same thing to some of the North Korean missile tests. They noted that a missile that when the Russians were using it had about an 88% success rate, was only succeeding about 13% of the time when the North Koreans were firing it off. Now, there's a lot of things that could explain that. They're just not as good at things as, there's a lot of complications in firing a missile. But the theory and the sourcing of the New York Times was that the U.S. was also conducting some cyber warfare that was sabotaging the North Korean program.
A couple more calls. We go to Philip in Mendon, Michigan. Welcome.
Yeah, I was wondering, can you give me an idea of how long it'll be till we get these hyperspeed composite rockets? They're like, if you got a rocket that travels 10,000 miles an hour, you can pretty much put away the ICBMs, couldn't you? I mean, if you can shoot a rocket that goes 10,000 miles an hour and knocks down an ICBM.
Well, what's that technology he's talking about?
I'm not familiar with that technology, but it sounds like something that would be in popular science.
Here we go to Chicago, next up on our Republican line. And Chris, welcome. Go ahead.
Yes, hi. How you doing there?
Doing fine.
Yeah, I wanted to comment on, nobody in our region in the United States would panic until we get some type of land missile on our soil. Then everybody will be will understand. But, China has these 9 or 10 man-made sand islands where they put missiles around their base, and I don't even believe that they own the water rights or the water, those particular land spots that they've created. And I understand they have to protect themselves. Can't we do those types of things, a couple in the Atlantic, a couple in the Pacific Ocean, where we make land or sand-made islands and put nuclear missiles on them to protect us?
Well, is there any indication the Chinese are putting nuclear weapons on those man-made islands?
The islands that China has put in the South China Sea, they've either taken a reef and rebuilt them. They put on sort of conventional military things, including anti-aircraft missiles to protect the islands. Now, the U.S. doesn't have a particular role in the dispute over those islands. Those are disputed by the countries in the region, but the U.S. does have an interest in asserting the maritime rights of freedom of navigation, and you can see that we've been involved in that. The U.S. doesn't need to put nuclear missiles on an island like, say, think about the Cuban Missile Crisis where Russia was going to put missiles in Cuba, because we do have ship-based missile defenses. So if we're talking about missile defenses, we already have mobile defenses that we can put in the Pacific on a ship. And if you're talking about offensive nuclear weapons, well, then your weapon of choice there is the ballistic missile submarine. We have 12 Ohio-class ballistic missile submarines, each one armed with up to 20 missiles. You know, one U.S. ballistic missile submarine has enough nuclear weapons to essentially end life on the planet as we know it. Just one submarine, which makes you wonder, why do we need 12?
Well, we do have the Hawaiian Islands, and that's the subject of an op-ed this morning by Todd Tiert, former congressman in the House Appropriations Defense Subcommittee. Departure North Korea, destination Hawaii, linchpin of America's Western defense, remains vulnerable to attack. Don't have time to get into it now, but you can look at WashingtonTimes.com for that op-ed. Providence, Rhode Island. Sean, good morning. For Jamie McIntyre, good morning.
Good morning. Two things. I didn't see the whole show, but one of my questions, which was sort of alluded to, do we coordinate our efforts with China in terms of North Korea doing something stupid, like if they launched an attack on somewhere? Because we couldn't just nuke them, I presume, because China would get a little bit upset about that. So that was one thing. The other is, I've communicated to C-SPAN on a number of occasions, but why doesn't C-SPAN include foreign newspapers in its summaries when they talk about this, that, or the other? I mean, the things we went through with our election and Trump and so forth, other countries must have an extraordinary perspective on these issues that it just seems it would broaden the understanding of your audience.
Your second point, Sean, is a very good point. We do try to incorporate more foreign coverage where we can. We'll make a note to do that, but very good point. To his other issue on coordinating with China.
Well, of course, the United States is trying very hard to get a coordinated policy with China about curbing North Korea's nuclear ambitions. As for what the response would be if everything failed and there was a war or a launch of a nuclear weapon from North Korea, I think the United States would be more coordinating with its allies, Japan and South Korea. And as I said, there's been lots and lots of military planning for that nightmare scenario, even as the emphasis has been on avoiding it.
Great to have you come by. Jamie McIntyre, who is a defense and national security reporter with the Washington Examiner. Read his reporting at WashingtonExaminer.com. And there's more, too, on Twitter at Jamie McIntyre. Thanks for being here.
You're quite welcome.
That'll about do it for this morning's program. We appreciate you joining us this morning and welcome you back tomorrow morning, same time, 7 o'clock Eastern, here on C-SPAN and C-SPAN Radio. Have a great day.